There have been discussions among the representatives of the parties in the House, and I understand we will now proceed to tributes to our late colleague, the Honourable Jim Carr. I now recognize the Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Monday, we lost Jim Carr. We heard the news a couple of hours later here in the House and held a moment of silence.
This was news that none of us wanted to learn. And it was a news that we weren't expecting. Jim had been fighting multiple myeloma and kidney failure, but he had always had energy and was able to manage many things.
Had stood in this House last week and talked about how much he loved his country. He said, "I love every square meter of this country, in English, en français, in indigenous languages, in the languages of the newly arrived." He said this as part of one of his final moments in this House, which were marked by the triumph of passing his private member's bill, the Building a Green Prairie Economy Act. It is an act that's about preserving a way of life in the prairies and unleashing a new potential. An act that makes sure prairie people see themselves represented in national policy, not just political leaders, but workers' unions, Indigenous peoples, farmers, and businesses. An act that seeks to leave behind a healthier environment. It was an act of hope for the future, an act of love for his country. It was also an act of courage. Jim understood that this wouldn't be his future, that it was ours. It was his kids and his grandkids. In October, he told me that he was stopping treatment. It was a private moment in his hometown. Jim knew it was for the best, but he never let up on his commitment to serving Winnipeggers, Western Canadians, and all Canadians, as well as to building a better future.
We all have just one life, and Jim showed us how to live our lives well, how to live our lives with decency, how to live our lives with integrity, how to devote ourselves to the service of others, and how to try to leave this world having made it a better place than when we arrived. We're going to miss Jim in caucus and in cabinet, but beyond everything, his family will miss him.
Jim embodied that unique set of characteristics that distinguish people from the prairies. His clear-headedness, his pragmatism, his decency. Our government will forever be better for it. All the staff that worked for him were drawn in by his warmth, and the members of the public service, too. Jim was a gentleman. He was a mentor. Jim was a friend to many. Jim was a great Canadian. Jim dedicated himself to public service right up until the very end of his life. But Jim lived many lives and distinguished himself in many ways.
Jim played the oboe in the Winnipeg Symphony Orchestra and was passionate about music. He was a journalist and attached great weight to the key role that a free press plays in a strong democracy. He had a profound Jewish faith and was a leader in his spiritual community.
Most importantly, he was a husband to Colleen. He was a father to Ben, Rachel, Rebecca, Kiernan, Daniel, and Jesse. A grandfather to Michelle, Sophia, and Markian, to his family. I hope that the gratitude of all Canadians for Jim's service, thoughtfulness, kindness, and generosity up until the very end can comfort you as you grieve. May his memory be a blessing. Merci.
The honourable member for Charleswood St. James, Assiniboia Heading.
I am encouraged, excited, and optimistic about how we can strengthen our federation in ways we have strived to achieve as a nation for decades. These were words from the speech delivered just this year on his private member's bill. Jim was a nation builder and a gentleman, but most of all, Jim was a true mensch. It's not easy for members to get their bills passed around here. It's a rare accomplishment. It's a blessing that Jim lived to see his bill pass this House. His bill was called the Building Green Economy in the Prairies Act. It just passed the House last week. Although it's a rare accomplishment for any MP, for Jim it was one of many, many great accomplishments in his life. Jim was a husband, a father, a politician, a journalist, and an accomplished musician, an oboist, in fact, who played with the Winnipeg Symphony Orchestra. He would always greet people with a great big smile, and he was always interested in how we could help them. As a politician, he was first elected to the Manitoba legislature in 1988 as the MLA for Fort Rouge and then Crescentwood in Winnipeg, where he served as the deputy leader of the official opposition for the Manitoba Liberals. Jim left provincial politics in 1992 to become a well-respected editorial writer and columnist. In 1998, he co-founded the Business Council of Manitoba, where he served as its president and CEO until 2015. It was in 2011 when he and I first met. I had decided to run in the 2011 provincial election, and I asked to meet with him in his capacity as head of the Business Council of Manitoba to discuss their policies. He immediately agreed to the meeting, and I'm pretty sure we met for over 2 hours that day, debating the nuances of the Manitoba economy and the importance of well-developed policy. In fact, I remember a long discussion over whether the provincial sales tax should be increased from 7% to 8%. Of course, as a good Tory, I argued against this increase. In the end, a gentleman throughout, Jim and I agreed to disagree on that one. During that meeting, Jim and I also discussed his admiration for former Manitoba Premier Duff Roblin. Jim admired Roblin for bringing in transformative education reform in the 1960s, and of course, everyone admired Premier Roblin for getting the Red River floodway built, what Manitobans affectionately call Duff's Ditch. During that meeting, Jim told me that he and Premier Roblin were in fact close friends. Premier Roblin had just passed away. Jim also told me he had assisted Premier Roblin in the writing of his memoir and was a close confidant of the former Premier. Even then, Jim was building bridges. Premier Roblin was a progressive conservative and Jim was a liberal, but it didn't matter what your political party was for Jim. What mattered was what you could accomplish together. When Premier Roblin passed away in 2010, Jim gave the eulogy, saying, "Throughout his long stint in public life, Roblin never had an ill word to say about anybody. Civility and respect were never compromised." Well, Jim, today I am saying that about you. In 2015, 23 years after he left the Manitoba legislature, Jim was elected as the Member of Parliament for Winnipeg South Centre, a role he cherished. He loved serving his constituents and he loved solving problems. He served in cabinet as Minister of Natural Resources, Minister of International Trade Diversification, and Special Representative for the Prairies. It goes without saying that Jim had the respect of all members of this House regardless of their political affiliation. He was a fearless advocate for the interests of Winnipeg, Manitoba, and Canada. Just 3 weeks ago, I was with him at the grand opening of the Leaf Diversity Garden in Assiniboine Park in Winnipeg, where he spoke optimistically about the future of Winnipeg. Jim was always an insightful and thoughtful speaker, and I always enjoyed very much listening to his words. Jim was also a strong supporter and well-respected member of Winnipeg's Jewish community. He would regularly attend community events and give remarks. He was a fighter against all forms of racism, including anti-Semitism, but in true form, always the bridge builder. He joined Winnipeg's Arab-Jewish dialogue, where members of both communities would meet together regularly to discuss and try and solve issues. In that speech Jim gave about his bill, he started it by talking about how he had won the private member's bill lottery. He said, and I'm quoting, "One does not plan in life to win the lottery, but when one does, one is left with decisions about how to take advantage of that good fortune." I think it's safe to say that all Canadians won the lottery for having Jim share his life with us. It was our good fortune. On behalf of my Conservative colleagues, I want to offer our sincerest condolences to his spouse, Colleen Souchet, his children, grandchildren, and his extended family. Mr. Speaker, in Judaism, there's a concept called tikkun olam. It literally means repair the world, to make it a better place. There can be no doubt Jim Carr left this world a far better place. May his soul be bound up in the bond of eternal life, and may his memory be a blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam dayan haamet. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, the judge of truth. Jim, we will miss you.
The Honourable Member for Avignon-Lamitis-Matane-Matapédia. Mr. Speaker, first of all, on behalf of the Bloc Québécois, I'd like to offer our most sincere condolences to the family of the Honourable Jim Carr, to his friends and to his colleagues in the House, in particular from the Liberal Party. Some things are harder to say than others. I would have liked our colleague Jim to be able to hear the kind words we have for him today, but life decided otherwise. So it's with a heavy heart, but with the greatest pride, that we pay tribute to him. When I was asked to speak, I thought long and hard about how to do it properly. I could have begun by praising his poise, his sincerity, and his sense of duty as a parliamentarian. I could have highlighted his political debut on the Manitoba provincial scene, where it was already clear that a formidable leader, proud of his roots and the people he represented, was developing. I could have highlighted his work as a special representative for the prairies, as Minister of International Trade Diversification, or as Minister of Natural Resources, where he initiated long-term work to ensure that the development of our resources was consistent with our environmental targets and the challenges of climate change. He recently saw his own bill go through third reading in this House and first reading in the Senate. He was determined to see his beloved prairies become greener. In politics, we debate. We see the problems and challenges facing our society, and we look for solutions. We rarely agree, and that's a good thing. The multiplication of ideas, different visions, and so on, it all feeds reflection. And from time to time, when we listen to one another, when we talk to one another without partisanship and good faith, we can come up with good ideas that serve the public interest. Jim Carr was a politician who knew how to listen and who, as we saw last week in his last speech, respected his political opponents. And we respected him in return. I could have limited myself to his political career in this House, but I would be leaving out the most important thing. Jim was, above all, an extraordinary person, a kind, gentle, generous, and brilliant man. A man whose heart was in the right place, as we say where I'm from. Regardless of his political affiliation, Jim saw, first and foremost, the human being behind the parliamentarian. I met Jim almost a year ago. He'd just been appointed chair of the Standing Committee on Public Safety, and he wanted to get to know the MPs he would be working with. So we met on Zoom on a Tuesday in January to talk about everything and anything, to get to know each other. We talked about our lives, our backgrounds, our families, and our interests. With our lives moving so fast all the time, I found it a little odd that this man took the time. I enjoyed that moment and all the others I shared with him. When he stepped down as chair of the committee a few months ago, we grew even closer. We were both in the chamber on Wednesday afternoons, and that was our time to touch base with one another. Jim wanted to be in Parliament until the very end, and he was. He was a true enthusiast, but more importantly, a fighter. To me, Jim is a model of upstandingness and goodness, and the time I spend with him is etched in my memory, and I always think of him when I set foot in this place. I will no longer meet his determined and tender gaze, but I know he'll be watching over us. Mr. Speaker, when a loved one leaves us, we always wonder about the last time we saw them and what words we said. We'd like to turn back the clock and take the time to do that. One of the last things he said to me will remain in my heart. He said, "You are a rising star in Parliament, Kristina, and it's fun watching you grow day by day. I'll see you in the House." Jim, you were a great inspiration to me, and I will miss you terribly. Rest in peace. I'll see you in the House. Once again, to all those who loved him, my deepest condolences. Thank you.
The honourable member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
Mr. Speaker, I rise here this afternoon with sadness to pay tribute to our friend and colleague, Jim Carr. And Jim was very much a friend and colleague to everyone here. In my experience, he was the best kind of politician, someone who truly believed in serving his community, his province, and his country. Someone who was always trying to reach across the aisle, to work together with all sides, someone who sought to bring people together. And I think some of those characteristics came from his varied career path. He used to say he was a bit of a hippie in his youth, and he was even a member of the NDP for a while. He was a professional musician, playing oboe with the Winnipeg Symphony Orchestra, and was a journalist with the Winnipeg Free Press. For a number of years, he was a member of the Manitoba Legislature. And he was also the president of the Manitoba Business Council and an early advocate for a clean energy strategy for Canada. That's the kind of background that really allows someone to see all sides of an issue and different ways of solving problems. And I got to know Jim when I was the NDP critic for natural resources and he was the minister. We traveled together several times. And I didn't always agree with him, but he always treated me with complete respect. To my mild discomfort, he several times introduced me at conferences as his nice critic. I was a bit torn about that representation, but it really did reflect the collegial relationship that we had. Jim was someone who really wanted to bring people together. In 2017, he organized the Generation Energy Conference in his hometown of Winnipeg. Jim was very proud of that conference and how it did bring together people from all over North America and indeed the world to his hometown to talk about the shift to clean energy. And in the middle of the conference, he invited many attendees to his own house for a party, which turned out to be his birthday party. I don't think the conference was planned to coincide with his birthday, but it was certainly a great way for us to meet interesting people who had come to tackle some of the difficult questions of our time, and all the while enjoying Jim and Colleen's hospitality. The following year, I traveled with Jim to the G20 Energy Summit in Argentina. And there he was very proud of the hard work that he and his team put in to bring the United States on board. And remember, this was in the middle of the Trump presidency, with a communique that talked of the climate crisis and the need to shift to a greener, low-carbon future. Jim moved into the international trade portfolio later that year, so I didn't see so much of him after that, but from all accounts, he brought the same energy and conviction to that file as he did with natural resources, having faith that parties that seem far apart on important issues could be brought closer together with honest dialogue. And he was also a great chair at meetings and made sure that that honest dialogue actually led to meaningful action whenever possible. Jim was so happy to see his private member's bill on building a green economy on the prairies pass through the House of Commons last week. And despite his long battle with cancer, he looked great and spent time thanking all of us who had supported him. He knew his cancer was terminal, but as he often said, every day counts. Jim loved his country. He cared about his community. He went out of his way to encourage new MPs of all parties. We need more people like Jim Carr in this place and at every level of government in Canada. On behalf of the New Democratic Party caucus, I'd like to extend my deepest condolences to his wife, Colleen, and all of his family. And I'd like to thank them for sharing him with us these past 7 years. And to Jim, I'd just like to say, farewell, my friend, Godspeed, Shalom.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Island.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci à tous mes collègues. Merci pour tous les...
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank all my colleagues for all the words in tribute to our friend and colleague Jim Carr, particularly those of the Prime Minister, the member for Charleswood, St. James, Assiniboine, Headingley, the member for Avignon, Lamitis, Matane, Matapédia, and the member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay. Everyone shared the same emotions, I think, because we've lost someone very dear to us, someone that everyone loved a lot.
For quite a long time, in that we were both, I wish I could be there in person, oh my, but we got to know each other through an organization that's playing quite a role here at COP15. The International Institute for Sustainable Development is based in Winnipeg. Jim was a member of the board. I overlapped with him on the board for 5 years, beginning in the year 2000. He went on to be the vice chair of the International Institute for Sustainable Development. And I saw the influence of that experience in working on sustainable development in his work in Parliament. It bound us together as friends before we met in the chamber as fellow members of Parliament. There have been many words said about his enormous depth of character, his range of interests, none of them superficial. Imagine being interested in music, but being able to play oboe at a symphony orchestra, being concerned with the rights of peoples around the world and serving to meet those ends in Parliament, his work for community, and I particularly to the member for Charleswood, St. James, Assiniboine, Headingley, I had wanted to mention knowing what a strong advocate for the Jewish community Jim Carr was always. His Russian Jewish descendants having come to Canada in the year 1906, he never forgot those roots. He was also, of course, a journalist. So much has been mentioned. I can only think of one thing that wasn't shared yet. So I wanted to say what I think a lot of us know. Jim was really funny. Jim had a killer sense of humor. He could have been perhaps a professional impersonator. I don't know how many of you ever got to see his quite killing imitation of JFK. He had Kennedy-esque looks, and he pulled off a Boston accent like nobody's business. He was enormously gifted, and he shared those talents with us all. The president of the International Institute for Sustainable Development, Richard Florians, said on the statement from that organization that Jim was, quote, a rare polymath, unquote. And that is a tribute to the ways in which he was able to come into our lives, into policy, into politics, into the arts, into community, into business, and never superficially. He's left an enormous impact throughout his life on so many different facets of our society. No doubt the Prime Minister is exactly right. He loved this country, every inch of it. I will cherish the memory that it's almost impossible to believe it was only 7 days ago that I hugged Jim next to his desk when Bill C-235 passed. It was a distinct honor, and one I don't take for granted, that he asked me to be his official seconder. It's rare to ask someone who's not in your own party to second your bill, but I hold it as a cherished memory, and I never would have believed that when I hugged him to congratulate him on Bill C-235, building a greener prairie economy, that was the last time I would get to hug him. We knew his days were not many, but each day made a difference. And as he said, every day he'd pass my desk to walk down to take his spot in the front row. And I'd say, Jim, how are you? He'd say, every day is a blessing. Let us remember his words and live our lives to be worthy of that knowledge. Every day is a blessing. Let us use each day as a blessing in the service of our Lord, whatever faith we follow. Let us remember every day is a blessing. And we are honored to have known you, Jim. Love you. I'll miss you. Deepest condolences and sympathy to Colleen and all the family. Et merci pour tous mes collègues pour cette opportunité.
And I'd like to thank all my colleagues for this opportunity to share a few words to underscore that we lost a giant, a great Canadian, a mensch. Thank you.
Honorables collègues, c'est avec une profonde tristesse.
Honorable colleagues, it is with great sadness that we rise to acknowledge the death of a great man, the Honorable Jim Carr.
Journalist, business leader, and politician, Jim was a Renaissance man. He excelled at whatever he chose to do. And luckily for those of us here today and for Canada, he chose a life of public service. With intelligence, kindness, and hard work, he committed to making the world a better place for the people of Winnipeg South, Centre, Manitobans, and all Canadians. His heart was as big as beloved prairies. Jim était un homme passionné, un homme d'action.
He was a passionate man, a man of action who was dedicated to making Canada a better country. He was a source of inspiration for all of us. His smile, his calm, his kindness will be an example not only regarding how to be a politician, but also regarding how to live your life.
When Jim had something to say, we all listened. He led by example, always ready to tackle the tough challenges of our time. He was a great communicator, a bridge builder, not only between individuals, but also between different interests and sectors. He always saw the big picture and kept his focus on what really mattered. He was a wonderful friend and colleague who will be greatly missed. I hope that in the midst of their grief, Jim's family finds comfort in knowing that his legacy will be deep and enduring in this place and across the country. This Canada that he so much loved. Thank you. Merci. I invite the honourable members to stand to observe a moment of silence in honour of our dear colleague, the Honourable Jim Carr.